the honeymoon phase. So the honeymoon phase lasts for very different periods of time for different attachment styles in general, but it generally begins at around 6 months and can last up until 2 years or just slightly over 2 years. Now, this is the phase of a relationship that actually mirrors the first 2 years or so of our relationship to our parents. So we come into the world as a child, and we can't really do any wrong. We're really loved and received and cared for, and we start to really be able to feel that love and recognize that connection and attunement in that early stage of our relationship to our parents. And so what happens is, right around the 2 year mark or so, give or take, every child in the Western world, at least, began to be conditioned, and this is that system of punishment and reward, where we get punished for doing things that our caregivers consider wrong, rewarded for things that our caregivers consider right. And this is like essentially where the power struggle stage begins with our parents. Now, our stages of romantic relationships are basically mirroring our stages of relationship to our parents or caregivers a lot of the time. And the reason for this is that our parents were our primary attachment figures in early life, and basically we use our adult romantic relationships to replace our primary attachment figures from early childhood. And this is sort of the leaving of the nest, right? Like, often we leave the deepest connection to our parents, and we start replacing that with our romantic partner, and we sort of pull away from our parents and really dive into the relationship with the romantic partner. And basically during this time, our figure of primary attachment does change. Now, if you're single and you're taking this course, you can also shift your primary attachment figure, believe it or not, into the relationship with yourself. If you start really honoring yourself, understanding your feelings, your needs, your boundaries, meeting a lot of these things from within, and sort of doing this deep dive into your personal growth experience, you can actually become your own primary attachment figure. And really what we want long term is this healthy balance of interdependency between ourselves and being able to meet our own needs and our relationship to another person. But let's go back to the honeymoon phase for a second. So usually from 6 months to 2 years, and this is the phase of the relationship characterized by us sort of having those rose-colored glasses on, or sort of feeling like love is blind. And we have very high responses of infatuation-inducing neurochemicals. So one of these is phenylethylamine. And then we also have oxytocin, the bonding neurochemical, serotonin, the well-being neurochemical, and dopamine, the neurochemical most associated with like motivation and taking action. And both of them sort of, serotonin and dopamine also both being sort of feel good, and somewhat euphoric neurochemicals to a certain degree. Now, when we have this like extreme infatuation and bonding stage existing, it can literally be, to a certain degree, as if you're not completely sober for this period of time. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. This is usually one of the natural stages in the normal life cycle of a relationship. But it's something to be aware of, especially for the anxious preoccupied, which sometimes you'll hear the slang form for the anxious attachment style called the love addict, right? So sometimes what we can see almost as this like lack of being fully sober neurochemically or at your neurochemical norm during the stage is sometimes we can see anxious attachment sort of give up on responsibilities, maybe shirk work or other important priorities, maybe become so hyper-focused on their partner, want to spend all their time together, feel really triggered if there's a withdrawal, feel afraid and alone if there's a withdrawal of the connection. And so what you're essentially seeing to a certain degree is almost forms of what we might see with somebody who's actually experiencing some kind of addiction, like extreme need, deep connection, longing, withdrawal symptoms if they're apart from whatever their addiction is. And sometimes as a result, life becomes unmanageable and it can spill into spaces in work and other relationships, foregoing friendships or other deep connections. And so it's just important to recognize any of these patterns. Usually during the honeymoon stage, there's more physical intimacy. And this is just something that research shows. Dating can be a close second, but it's usually the honeymoon phase that has the most physical intimacy. Attention of one or both partners tends to be hyper-focused on one another compared to other times of norm. And then there's the most contact as a general rule in this phase. And the other phases are sort of this peak that exists in the honeymoon phase, and then that starts to settle in and sort of balance itself out in the future stages. And this is just something to be aware of, because often for the anxious preoccupied, when the amount of communication and the frequency of contact starts to settle in and sometimes, go down a little bit after the honeymoon phase. Sometimes this can be something that's perceived as an alarm for the anxious preoccupied, and something they see as like, oh my gosh, we're growing apart, the relationship's ending. And it's really important to recognize that this is a normal pattern in the life cycle of a relationship. And the biggest lesson in this phase, as a general rule, for the anxious preoccupied individual, is to not throw the other areas of your life away during this phase, because again, this will make it really difficult in the power struggle phase. So you want to keep boundaries, you want to maintain your self-care and self-connection habits, and you want to not ignore the different priorities in your life. Otherwise, seriously, the power struggle phase will like whip you into shape more than you would like. And so you want to just take inventory frequently in the 7 areas of life and make sure that your partner is not your one source of your needs being met, and that you can also meet your own needs, and that you are not shirking any of the 7 areas of life in a way that's unhealthy. It's normal to be like, oh, I'm not going to work extra on the weekends for a little bit, or, to have a little bit more excitement, maybe take more vacations or things like that. But if this is excessive, you're going to run into problems, okay? So patterns in this stage. So number one of the main patterns is preoccupation that comes up for the anxious preoccupied in this stage of the relationship. Sort of thinking about your partner almost like 24/7, dreaming about them even, like excessive amounts of thinking and focusing on this person. And sometimes we'll also see the anxious preoccupied, again, like we were saying, sort of throwing away the other 7 areas of life, or 6 of the other 7 areas of life. And this can create imbalances overall in the lifestyle. And then, because we can get into this vicious cycle of like not empowering my friendships, not empowering my family relationships, not empowering my work life or my finances, because I'm spending all of that time and energy and money and all of it on this romantic relationship. Then when we enter into the power struggle phase where the mask comes off, sometimes we're like, but this is the person meeting all my needs. And we can cling more, which creates further imbalance, which then creates more anxiety. Because if that person doesn't meet my needs, I don't know how to meet my needs anymore myself, or I've imbalanced the other areas where I would derive my needs being met from. And so that can result in more neediness, which can result in more fear, which can result in more protest behaviors, which can sort of create this vicious cycle of challenge in the relationship. So it's really important to be aware in the honeymoon phase of any of your tendencies to start doing this and get this under control, and just be really clear about it and committed and disciplined about it in the best way possible as early in the honeymoon phase as you can. Over analyzing all your interactions starts to go away in the honeymoon phase a little bit. Like in the dating phase, that tends to be quite strong. It starts to die out a little bit in the honeymoon phase, and the perfectionism can also start to die down a little bit. You might feel a little more comfortable and safe being seen and heard. And there still can be pieces that come up quite profoundly of seeking evidence that your partner isn't interested any longer. So that can still show up for the anxious preoccupied, as well as the excessive need for validation can come up. There can be sort of this period of time for the anxious preoccupied in the honeymoon phase where, like, when they were dating, they were already quite a bit attached. But then as you get into the honeymoon phase, there can be this like, oh my gosh, I have so much love and care for this person. But because the care goes up, if the fear of abandonment hasn't been worked on, and if there's an imbalance in other areas of your life, so you feel more loneliness when you're alone, the fear of loss will go up essentially as the feelings go up, if that makes sense. So this can become something that's a prevalent focus in this phase, which again can start creating those early breeding grounds for protest behaviors and for challenges to take place in the next phase of the relationship during the power struggle space. So that can be really prevalent, the huge fear of loss and any like old insecurities that haven't been worked through. A couple other patterns that can start arising are feelings of jealousy, possessiveness, or seeking control. These things can become a little bit more prevalent. And this can sort of come up because there's this part of the anxious preoccupied that likes to identify their relationship as their sense of self. And so if I'm the anxious person, let's pretend, and I'm starting to be like, oh my gosh, this person's the love of my life, they're my sense of self. then I can start becoming more possessive because my mind is enmeshing their identity with mine. And so to a certain degree, I start feeling like I possess that person and that this person should feel like they possess me. And really, it's just unconscious patterns of enmeshment that are surfacing a lot of the time. There can still be a little bit of putting the person on a pedestal or worshiping, and then not meeting their own needs. It is very common that this imbalance starts to really take hold when the anxious preoccupied goes from dating to honeymoon phase. There's this usually very strong pattern where the anxious preoccupied is like, oh my gosh, we're so in love now, we're connected, and now this person's going to be the source of meeting my needs, and they start throwing their needs out the window. And then this places a lot of unconscious expectation and pressure onto the partner, which again create unhealthy breeding grounds for the next stage of the relationship. And this can be sort of like an accidental resentment gathering stage. And usually what we'll see is the anxious preoccupied, because they're afraid of loss, often they repress their feelings and needs for long periods of time, so they won't speak up when they start to feel this way. But you can think of it like the volcanoes building and building and building, and it is waiting to blow up to a certain degree. Not necessarily as much as the fearful avoidant, for example, but it can start creating this set of breeding grounds for resentment to take place, because remember, resentment is basically made up of a perception of imbalance. So if I'm the anxious and I'm giving, loving, and I have all these expectations that are so high, and I'm not consciously, challenging or questioning my expectations, now I start to build this image in my mind of the relationship where I give so much and the person gives so little to, next to the expectations I have of how much they should give, and this isn't going to go well as the neurochemicals start dying down as we move out of the honeymoon phase. So a couple of expectations we're going to go into, and tools and strategies as well as protest behaviors in the next part of this module, so stay tuned. So let's talk about the expectations in this phase for your attachment style specifically, and then I'll hold this next to some expectations that are average for the different types of attachment styles, so you have this point of reference when it comes to relating. So one of the first things that I see as a core pattern for the anxious preoccupied is there tends to be this expectation in the honeymoon phase of seeing each other nonstop. And this can literally be like almost in an addictive way, like I need to see this person. I've had clients tell me before that they were at work when they were in a long distance relationship. This one person particularly that I'm thinking of, she was at work, she was in a long distance relationship, and she said she couldn't bear, she was like, I couldn't bear to be at work when this person was visiting. And I literally had to leave work early because I couldn't stand it. Like I was so stressed and so frustrated that I was working when I should or could be seeing my partner. And, so it can sometimes be in this way that can have power over us. And that's when we're getting into sort of addictive territory, when we don't feel like we're fully in control of how we're feeling and how we're making decisions to a certain degree. And so this tends to be a really prominent expectation, like to see each other nonstop. Now, here's what's interesting. A dismissive avoidant, for example, if you hold this next to the anxious preoccupied, they do like to spend more time than they usually do in this phase for sure, but they may not want to see somebody nonstop. I have seen in certain cases that dismissive avoidants can see their partner like 5-6 days a week and can be quite excessive in this phase, and then it can drop way off in the power struggle and stability phases. But usually I'll see the average dismissive avoidant in this phase of a relationship want to see the person maybe 3 times a week, and that's like their peak. That usually is a lot for them. And fearful avoidance, maybe 2 to 4 times a week, and a secure is usually sort of 2 to 5 times a week. These are the general patterns I see. This does not speak for everybody. There's a lot of different layers to each individual. So different expectations can cause the anxious preoccupied to create painful interpretations and feel more insecure or more invalidated in the relationship, obviously. Now, a second expectation I see that's quite prominent for the AA is they often want to talk about the future a lot in this stage. And they can sort of be confusing it with part of the commitment stage and feel validated in making long-term plans. So a lot of anxious preoccupied, remember we said that fear of loss or fear of abandonment can escalate as the feelings escalate. So what essentially starts taking place is as a coping mechanism to deal with that fear of loss, sometimes the anxious preoccupied want validation and reinforcement, and this can take place in them starting to really plan for the future and being like, oh, when we have children, when we get married, when we move into this house, and they can talk a lot about those things that are very far reaching. Now, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. This can be a two-way conversation in a relationship. And it's a beautiful thing to talk about a lot of the time. And it's quite common that individuals do get married in the honeymoon phase of a relationship while it's still going on, or at least get engaged in this phase. But what can be unhealthy is when the anxious preoccupied is using this as a coping mechanism to buffer out the fear of loss, instead of because A, this partner is truly in alignment with what they want, and they truly see and have thought through the next stages of a relationship, that they can work through challenges, can work through problems, and they feel very much that their values and interests and plans and priorities align. And this can also be a problem when we're making these plans in the honeymoon phase yet, when we haven't seen necessarily the full depiction of this human being in the power struggle stage. The power struggle stage is where we find out a lot about this individual. And we also find out a lot about our capacity and that person's capacity to work through challenges and problems. And so if we plan too much in this phase, we can set these new expectations and create dynamics more for disappointment again in the power struggle phase of the relationship. So a third place that this can create a pain point is also because other styles may not be blurring phases of the relationship to the same degree. So like the anxious preoccupied can often be like, oh my gosh, honeymoon phase, and they can sort of rush in and try to and basically mentally emotionally skip over the power struggle stage and right into the stability and commitment phase of the relationship with their expectations, whereas other attachment styles, even secure individuals, may not be doing this at all or to the same degree, and this can actually move that attachment style more quickly out of the honeymoon phase and into the power struggle phase if that long-term or excessive planning and need for validation and reinforcement triggers a wounded part of a different attachment style. So let's just say, for example, that the anxious preoccupied is over planning with a dismissive avoidant. Well, because the dismissive avoidant often has a core wound of feeling pressured, trapped, overwhelmed, helpless, or invaded even, they can start being like, ooh, and those doubts can come up, and that can actually be the onset of the power struggle stage beginning. So it's just really important to be aware, and it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing either if you enter into the power struggle phase early, because all it essentially means is you're starting to learn the lessons faster of what you'll need to progress into the next phase. But it's just something to be aware of. Next, anxiously attached individuals often expect family, friends, parents, everybody to meet their partner during this stage. Now, this is relatively healthy. This isn't really a bad thing. I actually would advise that most couples, when they're in the honeymoon phase, it's a good time to start meeting and introducing to family. These are important pieces of information to gather. Like, do we connect? Does it work? Do they communicate? Do they like one another? Do they get along? But just in terms of holding this next to expectations of others, sometimes I will see dismissive avoidants particularly avoid introducing parents and family and friends for very long periods of time. And this can be really painful for the anxious preoccupied because they can be like, what the heck? I have seen quite commonly people dating for like 8 to 10 years and the dismissive avoidant partner still hasn't introduced the person to either their best friend, their parents, their sister or brother. Like, there's a lot of dynamics like this that are quite common. So just also important to recognize. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's about you. It can be because of deep intrinsic fears that the DA needs to work through within themselves first. And next, AAs often expect their partner, and this can be all styles, to prioritize the relationship as number one by far, because that's what they would do, right? That's their natural state or tendency. And so sometimes in this phase, what we do as human beings, honestly, is we unconsciously project how we would show up onto others and expect them to show up accordingly. And it's really important to be able to pull this apart and recognize, okay, this is how I would show up, but this is because of my own needs, my own values, my own personality structure, my own beliefs, and my own priorities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's going to show up in exactly the same way. And if they don't, it also doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship can't work. Sometimes the AA can be coming from a space of codependency in a sense, and they can be viewing somebody more secure or somebody dismissive avoidant as somebody who doesn't care enough about the relationship or doesn't care as much as they do, but maybe their care is actually coming from a codependent nature. And sometimes that person is actually a beautiful sort of lesson in a sense to help balance each other out, where let's say the DA almost acts against the passive codependent or the counter dependent, can be there to balance out the codependency and the anxious. And the anxious can also be teaching, in a sense, the DA how to open up and love and create more fullness in their relationships. So it's not that matters. It's not the prioritization. It's how we respond to it, how we communicate about it, and what boundaries we set around it, and how much we make sure that we are also not betraying our own needs and values in the process. So if I'm an anxious person and I do want relationship to be, top 2 or 3 priorities, and then I'm dating somebody and they're like, no, relationships like priority 7, in my life. My kids come first, my work comes first, my ex-wife and her needs come first, my hobbies come next, and there's this laundry list of things that come first. That doesn't mean like, oh, it's a great opportunity to balance the codependence and the counterdependency. It means that at some point you also have to recognize, okay, well, these things don't match up and maybe it's not going to work, and get really clear and question those things. So you have to check in with yourself and you have to see what's really working and what your priorities and expectations are, and how to communicate about them. So in the next module, we are going to go through the strategies and solutions and the different protest behaviors that can show up in the stages of the honeymoon phase for the anxious preoccupied. So let's talk about the protest behaviors and underlying fears that can show up for the AA in this stage. So number 1, resentment can begin to come out during this phase, even though it's still minimally, and the criticism might start, okay? So an example of this, quite simply, is, let's say, for example, that I am the anxious individual and I feel like there's this imbalance because I'm maybe acting from a slightly codependent space, and maybe I'm slightly out of balance in my own life, and I feel like I am giving a lot and not receiving according to my expectations. And this could be because the expectations are healthy and the person's just not receiving, and it's an imbalance of what people are willing to put into a relationship, and it's not a good situation. But it can also, and is often, that I'm the anxious and I have huge expectations that I haven't questioned, and I expect the same degree of maybe codependency from my partner as I am operating from, and this can be unhealthy. So we just have to get clear on what our version is, and really check this out so we can optimize our patterns entering into this phase. Now, if this criticism is beginning, you always want to look at your criticism as a symptom of an underlying need that's not being communicated, or an expectation that hasn't been questioned. That's just a little side note there, a tip. Next, sometimes we'll see the protest behavior starting where minor threats begin. Okay, so we haven't really touched on this one yet. This is when this can really start. So these can be things like saying, oh, I'd be better off without you, I don't need you, I don't think this can work. And usually, if not always, when the anxious preoccupied is making these threatening statements, it's because they are wanting more validation, and it's actually more of a test to try to push the person away in hopes that the person will come back closer. And this is very different from like the fearful avoidant, for example, who might make these threats as well as a protest behavior. But when they do it, it's because they're really triggered, and it's this form of intense self-protection that they then can recognize later and sort of take their walls down around. So it's really important to get clear on that element as well. Where is this coming from? Is this just a protest behavior because I actually have an unmet need of feeling validated, feeling safe and secure? And instead of going and communicating directly about the need, which is your tip and tool here, this is what you want to do. Hey, I'm feeling unsafe. I need some validation. Hey, I'm feeling like, I'm worried that I care about you so much and I'm afraid of losing you. Are we good? Are we okay? Where are you at? Instead of having that direct and healthy conversation, these threats are usually indirect tests to try to achieve the same result that you could in a much healthier way. Another protest behavior we will often see from the anxious preoccupied in this phase is they can begin to create arguments as a subconscious strategy for emotional connection. So let's imagine this. Let's say I'm Sally. I'm feeling a little disconnected from Bob. I don't really have a better tool of communicating that I feel disconnected. Bob and I haven't discussed healthy connection strategies and habits in our relationship yet. And I'm feeling frustrated that I seem to be triggered by this emotional disconnect and he doesn't. Sometimes the easiest or fastest way, though not the most effective, for getting emotionally connected is to start picking a fight. Because if I'm feeling emotional and I project my feelings onto you and you engage, and now we're both feeling emotional and we're both really present because we're really feeling emotional together, the subconscious mind actually often perceives this as a form of emotional connection. And remember, the brain always wants the fastest way to get its needs met, not necessarily the best way of getting its needs met. So that's just another really important thing to become aware of. And this can create a lot of profound shifts when we recognize this in real time, and we can go like this. Oh wow, I recognize something in me is starting to try to pick a fight, and this must mean that I'm feeling emotionally disconnected. So why don't I go to my partner and ask for emotional connection and say, hey, let's make some time together to be present this afternoon or this evening, or let's go out on a date soon. I'm feeling a bit emotionally disconnected. Let's do something where we can create more connection. When you go that way, it's going to be a lot easier long term, and especially as you get into the habit and routine of applying that tool, than it will to just start picking fights as the subconscious strategy to connect, which obviously has a lot of downsides long term. Sometimes also we'll see contempt language start coming out towards the end of the honeymoon phase. Again, those calling names, harsh judgments, etc. Disconnection can start becoming a major grief in this situation, or grievance. And sometimes, let's say for example that we have the anxious preoccupied, and let's say they're dating a dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant, and let's say these two individuals both tend to move out of the honeymoon phase faster than the anxious preoccupied. What can take place is this big grievance or almost like grief period for the anxious preoccupied, because they don't understand what's going on. Generally, the anxious preoccupied likes to stay in the honeymoon phase the longest, and they sustain the feelings of the honeymoon phase for the greatest lengths of time. So what we can see is a dismissive avoidant, for example, leaving and entering into the power struggle phase early, starting to have these things come up. The anxious preoccupied not being able to make sense of this, and as a result, sometimes the anxious preoccupied will start seeking attention outside of the relationship to kill the sting of not understanding what's going on and to try to fill their bucket up for their need for emotional connection and attention. Now, anxious preoccupieds are not usually the biggest cheaters out of all attachment styles, but they do tend to, this is very specific to what your boundaries are, but they do tend to get feelings and limerence pieces quite often, and usually limerence for the anxious preoccupied is a symptom of a disconnect that's occurring in a romantic relationship for the partner. So you can think of it this way. Let's say Sally and Bob again. Let's say Bob's entering into power struggle phase and Sally is feeling this emotional disconnect and she can't connect to Bob and she's trying. Then she might find, this coworker in her workplace gives her attention and says a nice compliment and has a deep conversation with her, and suddenly she has this big crush on this coworker, and this attraction is actually a symptom, in a sense, of a disconnect occurring within the relationship that she feels unable to solve. And so we always want to try to use that as a feedback mechanism and then bring that awareness into expressing a need we have from our partner in the relationship, instead of this happening in an unconscious way. And it doesn't, you don't have to judge it or anything like that, but it's an interesting feedback mechanism and a symptom of something being out of alignment in your romantic partnership. So the last two protest behaviors that can start showing up for the anxious preoccupied are accusations can begin occurring. So things like, especially if your partner's moved into the next phase of a relationship before you have, so things like, you like someone else, you don't want me, you are with someone else, and this usually comes because the anxious preoccupied's mind can't fill in the blanks. They're still in the honeymoon phase. They haven't recognized that stages of a relationship act in a life cycle form, and that different attachment styles move into different phases at different times. And so they can feel this inability to understand why somebody can be acting this way. And so the only seeming assumptions the mind can make are things like, you must like someone else, you must be with someone else, you don't want me anymore. And it can fill in the blanks with basically these worst case scenarios. So this is where we get these accusations, and that can actually feel, frustrating to the other attachment styles who are like, why don't you trust me? And they can feel hurt and internalize that, and that can trigger some of their own wounds, and then they bring that back, and it can create this sort of vicious cycle. So it's important to be aware if that's happening, and check in first with your expectations, with your partner's attachment style, have a conversation, see if they've moved into a different phase of the relationship, check in with this course before you go right to the accusation starting, because that can be damaging to trust in a relationship dynamic. And lastly, another protest behavioral pattern I'll see showing up for the anxious preoccupied in this phase is sometimes low level invasion of boundaries. So again, as the mind is trying to salvage how this person seems to be pulling away when everything's so great for them, and as the mind is trying to make sense of it and fill in the blanks, sometimes we start seeing things like the anxious preoccupied driving by this person's house at night. And I'm not saying this in like a negative way. This is just a pattern I've seen quite often. Not all anxious preoccupied individuals do this, but it's in a sense it's a coping mechanism related to trauma. It's like the mind's trying to fathom what's going on and figure it out. And so sometimes we'll see like the partner starting to go through the phone, emails, spying a little bit, asking questions, trying to collect information through friends or friends of friends, driving by the house, whatever it is. And again, this is a strategy to deal with their own triggers and wounds that are being activated in this stage. So if this is you, start questioning the stories that you're telling yourself, and go and communicate to your partner directly that you're feeling a certain way, and start practicing communication and healthy dynamics here, because this is very important as you start moving into the power struggle stage. Now, it is very important to realize that different attachment styles operate differently in each stage of a relationship. Like I mentioned, honeymoon phase will not be as intense or as long for the dismissive avoidant as it will for the anxious preoccupied. It's also very necessary to make sure that as you start to feel these symptoms of disconnect, you don't just like hyper focus on fixing things with the partner, but you start making sure that you are taking inventory and coming back to balancing those stages of those 7 areas of life within the relationship to yourself. And this is a very important time as we start entering into, the end of the honeymoon phase and the early part of the power struggle, to not just have healthy habits for self-care and staying grounded in your sense of self, like journaling, meditation, time with friends and family, but also to make sure that you are introducing healthy habits for connection in the relationship, like a date night, where you have deep conversation, checking in with each other's needs, communicating effectively, and keeping healthy exchange, give and receiving alive. Like making sure that you, as the anxious preoccupied, are feeling deserving, worthy, and open to receiving from your partner, because sometimes the anxious preoccupied, like we were mentioning before, can set these really intense breeding grounds for resentment in the power struggle phase, because they are giving, and not receiving as much. And sometimes this is because they're dealing with a different attachment style with different expectations. But often this is because the anxious preoccupied feels unworthy or undeserving of receiving. And if that's the case, you want to work on reprogramming that belief about yourself. And lastly, in our tip box here, make sure you are depersonalizing interpretations by checking on your stories. The mind often starts trying to fill in the blanks at this stage. If there is any shift or change in the pattern of the relationship, and it's at this stage, let's say you say, oh my gosh, my partner's becoming more cold, it means they're not loving me anymore, they stopped caring. It's at this stage you want to get really clear about the stories you're telling yourself and start questioning them instead of just directly buying it. So in the next phase of the relationship, we're going to begin talking about the power struggle and some really important tools to move through this phase of the relationship. If they don't communicate what those needs are, they're not checked in with themselves, they're not in relationship to self, and on top of that, they don't have healthy habits to help them maintain all the different 7 areas of life, the power struggle phase is going to be a doozy. It's going to be a really, really hard thing to navigate, because I want you to imagine the degree of self-abandonment that takes place when you're giving up all these areas of your life to make the person you're dating the center focus of your world. So let's say you don't take the promotion at work, or maybe you're not showing up to work in the same way, you're not spending time with your family and friends, you're not managing your financial habits, you're not, all of these like layer by layer parts of self-abandonment keep happening. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you see a change in the pattern of a relationship, when you see somebody pull back? If you're already abandoning your sense of self, there's no sense of identity here, that person's become your identity. So the anxiety that will come out of that will be 10x what it would be if it was just you having your sense of self and relationship. And maybe you haven't even done, reprogramming on core wounds. Maybe you haven't even done a lot of work on boundaries and needs. Maybe you don't know anything about attachment styles, let's pretend. But if you kept the areas of your life in order, and you had good habits, or you kept yourself, you saw your friends once a week, you saw your family once a week, if you have all of this, the anxiety is going to be way less, even if you didn't reprogram core wounds. So what this exercise is here for is to help you be really clear on who I need to maintain, what I need to maintain in the 7 areas of my life, so I keep having this relationship to myself in these areas, so I don't feel absolutely devastated if something, if a pattern shifts in the relationship. And what often happens is the more anxiety is there, the more extreme the behavioral output, right? Like if we feel 10 out of 10 triggered, we're more likely to use an unhealthy protest behavior that's much more unhealthy. Like maybe try to make the person jealous or threaten to leave just to see the reaction, not because that's how you're feeling. And then this is where we start throwing stones in our relationship, right? It's like we start throwing stones at the glass. It's like this is where we start having these patterns that even though we just are trying to do these things and have these protest behaviors to derive closeness, we actually might be really pushing the other person away instead. So you start in this exercise by rating the 7 areas of life and your relationship to these areas of life from 1 to 10. And again, you can do this from the perspective of a past relationship. So, where I got stuck in the last relationship and what my habits were like. Or if you're in a relationship now, you can check in here and see. Or maybe you're in the stability phase of a relationship, but you just want to reflect back to the honeymoon, so that if you do digress at any point or anything like that, you have these healthy patterns available to you. Okay, so we're going to look, and I want you to start by rating from 1 to 10. How balanced do you stay in these areas while you're going through the honeymoon phase of a relationship? So for example, in career, 1 to 10, how much do you keep career in check while you're in the honeymoon phase of a relationship? Does it fall by the wayside? Do you call out of work more often? Do you show up late? Or do you find like, you know what, even if I'm in the honeymoon phase and I'm, really focused on this person, I still show up really well, and I still never call out of work or go in late. And maybe you're like, I'm, an 8.5 out of 10, because maybe I don't work on myself and learn independently as much, but I still show up overall. So you're going to give yourself a rating based on that. You're going to do the same thing for mental. Mental will have a lot to do with like your hobbies. Like, are you learning? Are you reading? Do you normally read books or watch documentaries? Or do you have topics you like to learn about, or things you like to learn about in your spare time? Mental can even be like your thoughts and opinions. Maybe you have like certain political views, but then maybe if you're dating somebody in the honeymoon phase and they have differing political views, you silence yourself. Instead of making room for both opinions to exist and not having to have everything agree, maybe you don't speak up, you don't share yourself, and so you become out of balance from that perspective, right? So these are just some examples. Emotional, same thing. Like, do you find yourself totally diminishing yourself in terms of your emotions? Do you find yourself making somebody else's emotions way more important than yours? Do you find yourself checked more into what somebody else is feeling than what you're feeling? Do you find yourself, when you get into a romantic relationship, only soothing through the other person, not self-soothing? So take a look and see what patterns come up. Physical, pretty self-explanatory. Are you doing things like maybe you love exercising, but then you get into the honeymoon phase and you skip going to the gym to make sure that you are always available for a phone call or always available for a text. These are all very common patterns of an anxious, preoccupied individual, and they are all little tiny forms of self-abandonment that a secure person won't go through. There can be little tiny bits of it, but a securely attached person will say, no, like I I have a plan to go to the gym and let's do something afterwards. Or if they can't answer the phone because they made that commitment to themselves. So you're really taking a look. Spiritual can be like a practice or routine. Do you throw that habit by the wayside? Do you, if you are like more religious and maybe you always go to that other person's church, or do what they want to do spiritually and you give up your own spiritual beliefs, that can be a huge form of self-abandonment. If you are like genuinely interested in that and you're like, wow, I just resonate with this new thing so much, that's beautiful. But if you are just doing it to get connection with the person and to avoid abandonment, then it can be a painful form of self-abandonment. Financial, do you stop checking in with your finances? Do you not budget your money for dates, for how much money you want to spend per month on dates? Do you just spend all your money or take on way more of the bills? And if you want to do that, and if you're making way more money than the person you're dating and you feel that that's a healthy, appropriate thing, that could be okay. But if you haven't checked in with yourself first and you're just doing it to do it and to please, then it's self-abandonment. And the relationships, what I want you to focus on is like my friends, my family, my coworkers, the relationship to myself. Do I throw those things by the wayside? Okay? And then what you're going to do is some of those things I've mentioned, you're going to put a habit that you can take part in, that you will not abandon, once a week, to make sure you bring these things into balance. So, for example, career could be, I'm going to make sure I show up on time. I'm going to still do 30 minutes a day of something that helps me improve and learn a new skill related to my career, have a path for career growth. Maybe I want to change careers. Maybe I would journal for 30 minutes a day about what I'd be interested in doing instead, do some research. What is your 30 minutes a day? What is your habit to feel like that area is empowered? Mental, what's your hobby? What do you love learning about? What topics do you have? What thoughts and opinions do you want to honor? So basically everything we just went through, it's like a strategy to commit to and to have a checkpoint. And what I would highly recommend doing is, if you find yourself struggling with this, print this out so you can have this all written out and then reflect on it. Look at it first thing in the morning. Look at it last thing before bed. Make sure you're checked in. Oh, I could have done this today. I'll do it tomorrow. Oh, I can't wait to do this thing tomorrow. I'll structure it into my schedule right now. All these different things you can do to sort of give yourself that insulated sense of identity outside of just the relationship, which is going to be super important as an anxious, preoccupied individual.